I'm Colton,
And I'm Caelan.
and this is the Future of Thought. What do you credit for who you are today? Do you credit your biology? Do you credit your environment, your upbringing? Or do you credit who you are simply to your willpower?
So when we talk about who I am today, when I think about the building blocks of my person, I think mostly of experiences, actually. Of course, me and Colton are talking about nature versus nurture. And when you ask me that question, I usually think about, the morals I've been taught, the lessons that I've learned through experiences, and ideas that I've absorbed from my environment through listening, through seeing it. I can think of so many examples where I do things the way I do them today because of things that happened in the past. Um, for example, uh, I take a shower daily, right? Now, whether you take a shower once a week or every other day, I'm not here to judge you, but um, daily showers are a thing that happened because when I was little, I used to play outside a lot, and well, actually, now that I think about it, as we discuss this, it gets interesting because when I was little, I'd get dirty, and I would hate having dirt in my fingernails because I didn't, I was not so keen as to clip my nails as often as I should have, but I would get dirt stuck underneath there, and I was a pretty messy eater as a kid, and I just hated feeling dirty. Um, and so I would shower. And as I bring up this argument about how experiences crafted that pattern that I've fallen into ever since I was little, I'm starting to question, well, what exactly was that I was feeling, right? I'm not sure if everyone felt the same way or feels the same way when they get dirt under their nails. So it's kind of weird. I've already reached a brick wall with your question, but I'm still going to tell myself, and what I'm going to tell you is that I think it's experiences that have, for the most part, shaped how I approach things and my way of thought with a lot of situations.
It's a really interesting discussion today because although I did not know much about this until now, there is the studies of epigenetics, which is, in layman's term, the study of heritable phenotype changes, the changes of yourself that are not alterations in DNA sequence. And that seems to give some credence that there might be biological changes that are not simply DNA driven, if I understand it correctly. It's possible I'm wrong. But I think the bigger question, or really the bigger problem, is that people use the idea that, oh, I'm just like my parent, or oh, this is what we've always done, as an excuse, instead of
Mhm.
accepting that you can change your future. You can become self aware, become motivated and driven, and then change who you are, change who you want to be, change how you parent, whatever. People often say, "Oh, well, this is just how I've always done it," or "This is just how my parents did it. I must be the same." Like if your dad is good at basketball and you play basketball, you might think, "Well, I have good basketball DNA." Well, maybe if there's any truth to that, maybe you have more fast twitch muscle fibers, but maybe that's just a cop out and you could do more things with your life, but it makes you uncomfortable to go out of your comfort zone, as it were. You would rather just say, this is what I'm used to, this is in my DNA, as it were, and use that as an excuse. And I think that's really the biggest issue is, although there are some recent findings, as far as I can tell, that there is more DNA impact than originally thought. And I can give plenty of anecdotal evidence to this with me and my family, who I don't even talk too much. At the same time, my bigger question is not, is it nature versus nurture, although that's important, but how much priority should we be placing on these two ends of this spectrum. Is it really important if it's only 10% nurture? Well, why don't you nurture better 10% of the time? You know what I'm saying? Why isn't that, even if it's a small point, I think it could be prioritized better. But are you thinking along the same lines, or do you think I'm overstepping there?
So are you saying that we should, like, as a species or as a society, focus on uh, kind of these building blocks of helping people grow more naturally, I guess, into what they're more comfortable with doing through nurture? Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that we can't change our DNA. Well, that's becoming less and less true. But for the
Yeah,
sake
for the
of
most
argument,
part.
right? For the sake of argument, we can't change our DNA. We can't change how tall we are. We can eat vegetables as a kid, maybe get a couple extra inches, but for the most part, we're a certain size, we're a certain body style, we're a certain skin pigmentation, which is obviously contentious right now and has been throughout all of human history, I'm sure.
Hmm.
Uh, we can't change these things about ourselves. But if you believe in any non determinism whatsoever, if you believe in any sense of willpower, then even if who we are is only a small percent affected by our influence, and I suspect it's a large portion, but even if it is just a small amount environment, then what's really important is that we make the most of that, because you can't change your DNA for all intents and purposes. So why even care, right? Why even prioritize it
Oh.
when you can just think, okay, even if it's only helping my kids 10% to be a good parent, hey, let's be a good parent who's thought provoking and lets my kids experience the world in certain ways. And obviously that's easier said than done. But that's kind of my point, that even if it's only a small percent of who you are, which I suspect it's a majority, but I am no psychologist. Even if it's a small percent, why not care about it, right? Why not prioritize the fact that you can have an effect on your family or on those around you, or even on yourself through your own self awareness and passion and drive? uh, I mean, why would you not prioritize that? Does that kind of clarify what I'm saying?
Yes, it does. So, well, we'll see in a second. If I regurgitate to you what you just said, then good. I think I understood it. So you're basically saying that letting us, regardless of what stance you take on the nature versus nurture argument, letting us be defined by whatever percent of it actually is nature is a bad idea. And you think that whatever percent that we can to improve and change and grow as people through nurture, even if it's very small amount, we should capitalize on that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I always take it back to something which a lot of people will think is a little bit extreme, but I always take my opinions and my perspectives on life back to a sense of purpose and morality. In the sense that, for me, I think human well-being, or more nuanced, the well-being of conscious creatures, is the reason to be here. That's increasing well-being is the goal in life, let's say. And in doing so, if you can't change your biology, again, that's a generalization at this point, but
Mm-hmm.
let's just say you can't change your biology, there seems to me to be almost maybe no greater purpose, no greater goal at all than to affect your phenotypic expressions. There's no greater purpose than to raise kids in a way that affects society positively, and there's no more important value in life once you accept that human well-being is the priority. Now, of course, there's this clear religious backlash to that in some ways, because fundamentalist religions would say, well, it's not about human well-being, it's about respecting a deity or something, and that's an argument you can certainly make. But once you can, at least for those of us, accept that well-being is at least really important, which I'm sure most people can regardless of their values, then it seems to be a no-brainer to not prioritize uh, influencing those around you in a positive way, if at all possible.
Interesting. Right. I can think of a couple of examples of I can think of a couple of examples of such an environment in which that people's parents have pressured them into following the beaten path, and you end up hearing or seeing nothing about them at the end of the day. And to me, the most obvious examples have to do with celebrities, um, because obviously they've found success in whatever skills they have. And often they start families, regardless of who it's with. And sometimes you hear nothing about their children. Um, Kind of a caveat to that is Will Smith and Jaden Smith. Obviously, I'm sure many people have heard of Jaden Smith. It's kind of weird. I was watching a YouTuber review After Earth, which is a movie that came out starring Will Smith and Jaden Smith, his son. And this YouTuber showcased a bunch of interview audio with Will Smith and Jaden Smith, and it became pretty apparent that Will Smith was kind of pushing this agenda, pushing this the same lifestyle onto his son. The same popularity, well renowned kind of acting Hollywood lifestyle. Um, I mean, I don't know Jaden nor Will Smith personally, but just from looking at the footage, you can tell that. Um, and to be super critical, I mean, he's not an exceptional actor by any means. I would not go out to say that Jaden Smith has the talents of Will Smith. Um,
He's got time.
yeah, he's still very young, and I shouldn't be so quick to judge something like that when I myself probably would pass as a F tier actor. But it's definitely interesting. And when I look at scenarios like that, I sit there and wonder what they actually want. It's hard to find out because it's behind so much news coverage and so much press coverage that warp it into something that it might not be entirely. But you sit there and you look at these kids, and kids are especially an interesting topic when it comes to this conversation, and for obvious reasons. Very impressionable. You're still learning, and if we are to bring it back for a quick moment to nature versus nurture, I mean, I totally think there has to be some nurture. Um, when you look at children developing, obviously you have to teach them things. Um, I can't name the experiments off the top of my head, but I think there were a couple of experiments in history that completely isolated people from society for their entire lifespan, and they came out, entirely different than a regular human child. And so I think that's a testament to the fact that there is at least some evidence of nurture being present, and to ignore that, I think, might be going down the wrong path. But I think it is totally dangerous, and this is where I'm going to agree with you. I think it's totally dangerous to sit there and encourage, do what your father did, do what your mother did, instead of, do what you find you want yourself to do. That kind of change in mentality, which really does kind of sound like the difference between nature versus nurture butting heads. So yeah, I think I understand. I hopefully that sounded about what you were trying to tell to me. And that's my stance on it. Yeah.
Honestly, it's really interesting because you mentioned the idea of, is this what the kid wants to do? You mentioned Jaden Smith, like, oh, does he want to be an actor like his father?
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you think. And I have a strong opinion on this, but I'll do my best not to state it just yet until you have a chance to respond. But it makes you wonder, can your upbringing, your environment, and so forth, can that actually shape what you want? Does it shape what you want? It's not the idea simply, maybe, that, oh, I am biologically this person. I'm a certain personality type and I'm going to be best in this job. Maybe it's the idea rather that because of how I'm shaped by my parents, let's say Jaden and Will Smith, because my dad's an actor and he pushes that on the family slightly, let's say, that makes me want to do that inherently, not just because I want to be good and make my parents proud of me, but maybe you actually intrinsically want that. And it reminds me of this, the movie that came out recently. maybe it's more of a documentary, Three Identical Strangers. Have you seen that?
I have not yet.
So yeah, just for some background and small spoilers here, if you haven't seen it, to anyone listening, yourself included, Caelan, I apologize. Nonetheless, in that movie, I'll just call it, you have three individuals who, as the name suggests, are identical. They're identical twins, separated at birth, more or less. And they grow up not knowing each other. And then one day, two of them meet, and then they find a third one, and they make a story out of it. But what's really interesting is that when they go on news channels, or when they're interviewed, when they make skits, whatever it is that their life entailed, it's only talking about their similarities. Everything they do is, let's go on stage, dress the same, let's talk the same, let's have similar haircuts, and let's make a show out of it. And it was probably smart from a monetary perspective. But then as you get towards the end of the show, and this is where spoilers somewhat come in, you realize they're not actually the same people. They have different passions, more or less. They look similar, but even their looks start to change somewhat over time, and that may be a product of this phenotypic plasticity I briefly mentioned earlier. They're not really the same people, right? And it's just really interesting because you just assume they're the same because they tried to make it seem like they were the same for this sensational story. But that's just one example, I think, that shows, well, their environment clearly shaped them.
Right? Yeah, no, I can totally attest to that as well. I mean, I don't like relying solely on anecdotal evidence, but I think in the realm of psychology and specific instances, we're discussing something that doesn't even have an answer yet. I mean, I might as well bring this up, but my whole passion for engineering and airplanes, I feel like I can attest to, um, or not attest, I can correlate that to experiences I had in my childhood, especially knowing that my dad's an engineer. Um, I used to love airplane watching when I was a kid. Um, I think these experiences helped shape the career path that I wanted to dip my toes into first. And it's definitely interesting. I really, in the future, I plan on doing more research on actors and musicians' children, um, merely because I feel like that's a good place to look for if you're trying to figure out how well, you know, your home environment shapes what you want out of your life. Um, I think I have the luxury of having a family that's urged me to find out what I like myself, and they're completely judgment free should I choose I don't want engineering as a degree, right? And the more I go into engineering, the more I learn that mathematics is, I freaking hate the crap out of it. But and I think I'm getting a lot of amens right now from many different types of people. But and then I dip my toes into music a little bit, and I start learning. I like music a little bit, and sometimes, when I was younger, I tried drawing, and I like drawing, but it's always this finding out what you like. Um, when I'm talking about my personal experience, but the first thing my head went to is aerospace, and I definitely think that's because of the environment I was raised in, for sure.
So then, to clarify, you don't just think that you were influenced by your environment, but that your wants themselves, not just what direction you were pushed, but what you actually sincerely want, then you think that could have been influenced or was influenced by your childhood, let's say.
Yeah, I think so, and I'm not gonna say that merely home life could have influenced that, but I think the selection of peers and friends that I've had leading up into this moment have also helped decide that. Um, Especially in the instance where if you're someone who doesn't have a very sturdy or even reliable home life, and you have a family that has been struggling, or one that's not even there for you, I mean, the next social group that you'll probably learn from and learn things from. I said that twice, didn't I? We'll ignore that. Is the people you go to school with, because I don't know the actual percentage, but I'd imagine most children in at least the United States attend primary school and then middle and high school, and if your home life sucks, but you're gonna learn how to have fun and what to look forward to from your peers. At least that's my take on it. To simply answer your question, yes, I think it can influence your wants.
So let's take this a step further then, because you
Okay.
know I love doing that.
Yes.
So if we can both acknowledge, which I think we do both acknowledge, that individuals are largely, not entirely, but largely influenced by their environment growing up as children, especially, but as well as their current environments.
Mm-hmm.
If we acknowledge that, then is it not a what am I trying to say? Is it not a clear follow up that people who had a terrible upbringing, who had crappy parents, who were maybe abusive or whatnot, that those influences made them who they are? And if that's the case, which we will both say is somewhat the case, I suspect, do they still deserve equal blame for a criminal action, right? So if someone
Mm.
was abused as a kid and that's all
Mm-hmm.
they know and that's how they thought you should teach your children obedience and the right way to do it, let's say, whether or not I agree, and then they do the same thing to their kids, but as time changes that becomes less and less acceptable, do they deserve the same amount of blame as someone who didn't have that upbringing and then also beats their kids? Like where does the blame game come, right? Who deserves more blame intrinsically, or is it necessarily equal because of your, let's say, free will? And there
Interesting.
might not
That's
be a right answer.
well, yeah. If I ever give an answer, I hope no one takes it as the right one, because either a lot of people are going to end up. Well, I'll just go with the assumption that no one's going to think I'm the psychotherapeutic professional. So, um, that's an interesting question. That is a huge question. There was a case not too long ago. Um, the specifics I don't remember. I remember talking with to my parents about this and my family about a mother who was charged for her son taking a gun to school. Um, I forgot what state, what city. I forgot their names. I'm sure there are many instances of this besides this one that I'm bringing up right here. Um, but she was charged on multiple accounts. I forgot what the charges were as well, I'm afraid. But basically, the gist of the story is that her son took a gun into a school and started shooting at police before taking his own life. No one was harmed, but obviously there could have been intent or whatever with the exchange between the kid and the law enforcement. And the mother was tried, and it's it's different. It's definitely a hard case to look at, because when you look at the interviews, when you look at uh, how she testified, it definitely seemed like she tried everything. She went to doctors. She tried putting her kid on medicine, and then she stopped that because she didn't like feeding her children, chemicals that she didn't know any adverse effects of. Should they, be withdrawn from that, right? Very real fears that I'm sure we'll all have if we were to be parents one day. And her kid still did this, no matter how hard she tried, at least from her perspective. And so, you know, whether the kid actually had, a problem that was merely unfixable due to the nature of, his brain and how his brain works, and, the depression and the emotions he felt coming in, um, or whether or not the mother was actually abusive and did a really good job of looking innocent on television, I couldn't tell you that much. But I don't know. I'd have to think on that one for quite a minute. Do you have an answer to that one, Colton?
Well, I don't for sure, but I do think it's interesting that bad things can happen from people in good homes as well. That's
Right.
something I always think back to, and I'm not saying that this discredits the idea of the home life because I actually don't think that at all. But it is interesting. It makes you wonder if you can accept that influence uh, determines part of who you are in a sense, which again
Mm-hmm.
I will, and it sounds like you certainly do. Then the only logical step to legislating it, let's say, in any meaningful way seems to be, unless I'm overstepping here, seems to be some kind of objective measure. Something I've talked about in the past with conversations between Caelan and I are is the idea that if you have an objective pain scale, that could be
Mm-hmm.
a major suppressant of the opioid crisis, because or maybe not just the opioid crisis, but over diagnosing with medicine, right? If you can understand what pain someone's actually in, if you ask them from a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? And they say 10, but their 10 is someone else's 3. If you can objectify that through some kind of brain measurement, then you could obviously stop it, right? Or at least
Mm-hmm.
prevent it. So it's a similar idea that if you could measure what part of their brain or how much of someone's brain is is shaped by their past, which I can't imagine how difficult that would be and how many centuries of research it'll take to get there. But through artificial intelligence, I presume it could be quicker. And I just wonder, that seems to be the only next step because how can you legislate what someone's background determined in their life? Because sometimes the good backgrounds lead to people doing bad things. And I think it's certainly still a possibility that those things were not determined by a biology. And if
Right.
you can accept that, which maybe you do, then we have to have some kind of at least near objective way to legislate that, to um, adjudicate that, if that's the correct term. If there's a jury for them to understand it completely, how can we go about that? And I think that's the really important question here. If bad things can happen from good households too, maybe not as often, and if those things aren't biological, which I suspect they're not entirely, we have to find a way to proceed legally, or else you're going to be putting people who are otherwise innocent, not innocent, but otherwise innocent aside from their trauma or brain malfunctions, in prison, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're not completely to blame. Maybe that's a crazy idea. I don't know. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Before we continue, we'd like to make a quick announcement. We run this podcast ad free. Of course, with a trial version of Spotify, for example, some ads are out of our control. However, we will never run third party ads during the Future of Thought podcast. This podcast acts to promote accessible, unhindered discourse for all who listen. Because of this, we rely on you, the listener, to support this podcast. Support us by visiting our Patreon at patreon.com/the future of thought and selecting the tier of your choice. Regardless of how much or how little you choose to donate, you're a greatly appreciated listener. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
So the thing that's hard for me to understand when I look at a situation like this, and before I continue, I do think that's a good solution. I mean, I'm not going to say good because we haven't practiced it yet, but I'm going to say that's a solution I find interesting because in all of these cases, it is so hard to understand. I mean, really, that's the goal. That's the end objective, is to understand. I guess let me put it this way: it's to create a medium through which you can understand how someone feels about the same thing. Because I'm almost certain that everyone will feel at least a little bit different in some small particular aspect when reacting to the same exact image, for example, right? Someone will have a small little different quirk or whatever about them react differently. And temporarily, I'll cast aside the argument of nature versus nurture, because fundamentally, I'm going to assume that everyone's at least a little bit different in how they react and perceive things based on the accumulation of their experiences and their biology. But, when I think of these cases, I find it hard to understand what the child is going through, right? When you talked about these objective scales to measure, in your particular example, pain, if I could understand what the child was going through, right? I mean, that would be pretty advanced technology, man. that is far off in the future, or maybe not. Actually, I mean, depends on your take on the whole rapid evolution of technology. But I mean, as I see it, I don't see another solution yet. This is a big problem that I have not thought about too much in my free time, unfortunately. The whole, trying based on, your predecessor did this. Were you just a bad parent? You're going to get part of the charges or all of them because, your kid's still developing, right? And so it's completely out of their control if they do something bad because they did it based on a role model and you were that role model, right? I mean, that would be going completely off the nurture assumption. And it seems how we're currently doing it, it goes completely off, assuming that you were the bad parent in the instance. And like you said, I imagine that's putting a lot of innocent parents either in jail or in a lot of financial trouble. So, yeah, if there was a way to somehow figure out how someone else's brain perceives something, then I think that's the key. Because when we both look at an image of someone getting shot, for example, I'm sure the most common response is going to be either, heightened heart rate, sweat, nervousness, maybe even anger or sadness. It's going to vary differently based on different people. And that's just an assumption. I mean, that's with a very little knowledge I have on psychoanalysis and how, on how the human brain works. If we could find a medium through which to communicate to each other that, our feelings aren't too far off or it's feeling entirely different. I mean, I like your idea. Yeah, I like it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was. Go ahead.
Well, part of it too is we just know so little about the brain. If we even wanted to pin this down further to something that'll likely be figured out, solved in the nearer future, maybe not 1,000 years, maybe 500, you could look at what age does intent come? Because intent is important. I realize it's a common discussion going around today, mostly left-leaning groups, but I'm sure it also is on the right somewhat, of this idea that intent doesn't matter. Now, if you're talking about involuntary manslaughter, sure, that's one thing. But if you're talking about making an insensitive joke and you just were ignorant of the fact it's insensitive and then you actively work to change how you present yourself, well, you can't really be blamed for making the insensitive joke. You didn't know. Or if you call someone an old-fashioned term, like you call a female woman in a certain way, and if you didn't actually mean it in a derogatory manner, sure, you're outdated. Sure, it probably is insensitive, but if you don't have any insincerity or malintent, there's obviously less fault there. I think most people will agree with that.
Yeah.
Some people don't, but I think most will. But if you can start measuring the brain, which I don't know if this anecdote is true, but we know less about the brain than we do about the ocean, and we know less about the ocean than we do about our solar system. If there's any truth to that, then sure, it's difficult, but we could really, we could learn a lot from understanding the objectivity of the brain. Of course, that can lead to a different discussion we won't talk about today in terms of free will, because if you take that to one extreme, neurons work very similarly to binary, and then you no longer have free will. So I realize that takes you down a path that we don't have to unpack during this episode, but Yeah, it is. I don't know. It just seems like the only possible outcome with any meeting is objectivity. And that applies, I think, to every domain. When everything's subjective, you inherently have slippery slopes. You inherently have inaccuracy. That's just my view on it, at least.
Right? I mean, this started out as kind of like a nature versus nurture thing, but I think it blows up into so many other things because it deals with the human psyche and our social interactions with each other. Um, I am sorry if. Okay, hold on. The viewers just heard a big ol' do 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 because my computer is not shutting up. Okay. Um, where were we? Oh yeah, right. So nature versus nurture is kind of where we started it, and we kind of went on a tangent to all these specific examples. Um, Now we're talking about objectifying things, right? We're talking about creating a way um, through which we can understand each other. I mean, I think that's ultimately the goal. I mean, when I think about many of the instances that I feel hatred or fear or aggression towards a particular ideology or group of people, usually it's because I don't understand how it works. And other times I might understand how it works and I know it's not for me. And usually that's good. Um, but a lot of it stems from, this whole idea of fear of the unknown, blah blah blah. I'm sure many of you've heard it so many times before. But with creating a truth, so to speak, um, there is no more unknown. There is no more uncertainty between, oh, I don't know if I can trust you or trust your ideas and what you're doing, when there is a right answer, right? Right now, with the current day we live in, it's hard to argue a right answer, right? Because you'll have so many people come up with counter examples and other things that are rooted in the idea of subjectivity. Um, for example, racism, right? Talk about something that's very topical right now, and very, very huge across the world, really, as of recently. Um, when I think about someone who's racist, it's very interesting to me to think about, what made them racist. Uh, was that an inherent fear? I mean, in my opinion, I usually think racism is bred from, a generation of people continuing to teach it to their children, and certain information that's being blocked out. Um, Nowadays is an interesting study on the human condition, in my opinion. I haven't really looked into it too much. I've tried to tune out of the news recently because obviously, in my opinion, the news does not do a good job of telling you something at face value. It tells you it with a lot of red tape and a lot of other crap, so that they can push an agenda or make money or whatever the hell they might be trying to do. Don't get me wrong, there are some people out there that are trying to spread honest and truthful information, but it's very hard to find between all the guck and filth that's on top of it. But, I mean, ultimately, in my opinion, if we can learn to understand each other in a way that we can respect each other but disagree, I think that's the ultimate maturity, in my opinion. Because I don't think we necessarily all have to agree on the same thing, because at the end of the day, I don't know how easily it will come to humanity, the single correct answer to a lot of these scenarios. And if it does one day, that'd be awesome, because then there is a irrefutable correct path, and to refute that is just going to label you as either dangerous or ill fit for humanity. But as of now, I mean, especially in current day, if we can just, like you were trying to get at earlier, I believe, if we could just nurture this idea of curiosity, growth, and throwing away the fear, so that way we can nurture in ourselves this better understanding of each other, So that way, maybe I disagree with you, but I'm going to disagree with you in a way that I don't want to hurt you, or I don't disagree with everything else you have to say, right? Like categorizing everyone in one big group and then saying all of you are stupid because you believe A, B, or C. You know, it's I feel like it's that sort of thing for me. That may have been
I,
irrelevant, but I think that's
no, I actually would love to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm restraining myself from doing it just for the sake of saving it for another episode. That's more on topic.
mm-hmm.
But I love the thought, and honestly, even to tie it back in, ignorance, or as you were saying it, awareness on the opposite end, is vital to understanding everyone else's opinions and, frankly, to this discussion of nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
You can't, well, let's say it like this: you must have information to draw solid conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's a requisite for the latter. The former is a requisite for the latter. And because of that, this brings us not to an impasse, but to a beautiful unknown. We don't have the answer of whether or not we are 12% nature and 88% nurture, or if we are basically just biological replicas with some screw ups in the DNA, and that's our future. We don't know the answer. I bet it's somewhere in the middle. We would both say it's somewhere in the middle, whether or not we agree completely on the percentages. But that's the great thing about not knowing something, is it allows for the pursuit of knowledge. That pursuit is so beautiful. And once individuals begin to appreciate not just the end game, not just the becoming rich, not just the becoming happy, not just the having the answer to whether or not your biology or your just phenotypic expression.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can respect that pursuit and enjoy that pursuit, or at least respect the individuals who enjoy that pursuit and listen to what they say and promote civil discourse and have some discussions, have some empathy, then we'll get to the answer. We don't have an answer for you. So anyone who listened for, how long have we been talking? 40 minutes? I have no idea. But for anyone who came in here thinking, oh, these two guys, they sound at least moderately intelligent, they're going to have an answer. Well, we don't. I hate to tell you, you should leave. But we do value that pursuit of an answer, because someday someone's going to sit down and have a podcast just like this. It's probably going to be in virtual reality, but it's going to happen nonetheless. And they're going to say, hey, this is what percent biology we are. This is what percent phenotypic expression we are. And that's a beautiful thing. And that pursuit allowed that to happen. And then you'll have further discussions. I mean, discussions will never stop. So really, if I can send home one message, I can't talk on behalf of both Caelan and I, but I suspect we think similarly. Love the pursuit. Accept the ignorance, not for the sake of being comfortable with your ignorance, but for the sake of acknowledging your ignorance. And then go find the answer, or find someone else who has the answer, or listen to different opinions, because shaping your world only around your biology as an excuse, it's not helpful. It doesn't empower anyone. But then at the same time, failing to acknowledge biology, well, that's not helpful either, because you are disregarding an aspect of your human nature, potentially. So really, just to reiterate, respect the pursuit, love the pursuit, be self-aware, and have conversation, because civil discourse is the only path towards a somewhat successful future.